Is democracy dying? All over the world, we're seeing similar trends: autocratic government, suppression of freedom of speech, and the use of information technology to monitor and control populations. For those of us who grew up thinking democracy meant having the right to say what you think about a government's policies, it's depressing to watch. And I've got bad news. The astrology I'm looking at suggests to me that representative democracy could indeed be on the decline, and perhaps even that the era of liberal democracy is over. But there's good news too. Where there's crisis, there's opportunity. And the coming years might present us with a chance to upgrade political systems so they're more fitting for the times we live in. In this episode of World Astrology Report, I'm going to take you through the planetary cycles and history I'm seeing that suggests democracy is in deep trouble. But we're also going to take a look at the new possibilities that these times present us with. I'm your host, Dan Waits. This is World Astrology Report, and welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. Before we look at the astrology, let's survey the landscape. Now, it feels to a lot of people these days like democracy is on the rocks in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. People on every side of the political spectrum will, of course, be pointing fingers at the other side now, going, yes, Dan, exactly. It's those right-wing fascists or those shit-lib communists over there. They're destroying democracy. But the picture is more complex than that, because whether we're talking about more autocratic states or those with long democratic traditions, we're seeing the freedom to speak out slipping away all over the place. This is absolutely true in my own country, the UK, where people are getting knocks on the door by the police or even going to jail for tweets and Facebook posts right now. The UK is arresting more than 30 people a day for supposedly offensive social media posts. Now, the UK is just one country, obviously, but it has a long democratic history, including of freedom of speech. And the fact that the UK itself is backsliding in this way looks symbolic of the times that we're living in. The UK's extremely unpopular Labour government now wants to bring in a digital ID system, which is something that the dread pirate Tony Blair has been pushing for decades now. Supposedly, this is to prevent illegal immigrants from taking jobs. And maybe that's part of it. But it seems to me that there's an element of creating a problem and then providing the solution, a solution that happens to perfectly suit the purposes of totalitarian government. The UK isn't the only country trying to bring in a digital ID scheme. I recently read a tweet stating that 17 countries had rolled out or passed digital ID laws in the past 3 months. I checked the tweet out, and as far as I can tell, it's true. These countries are all marching towards digital ID. It's a bit weird, isn't it? Why the great rush to do this now and in lockstep? It's almost as if there are coordinating mechanisms that stand above national governments that want this done and want it done now. As many people are pointing out, and as I've said many times on this channel, if you bring together digital ID, digital currency, digital border control, and AI, you have the perfect system to create a totalitarian nightmare, because you then have everything you need to exert total control on the citizens of any country. And no matter where you stand politically, you need to be aware and probably even worried about this. History shows us that power always avails itself of whatever tools are available to it. So I'm going to keep banging on the table about this because it's an outcome we really need to avoid. I'd also like to take a moment to recommend the English writer Paul Kingsnorth's brilliant new book, Against the Machine here, which describes the ongoing surrender of humanity to what he calls the machine, what Jacques Ellul called technique, and which Rudolf Steiner called Ahriman. Now, beyond the UK, there's also weird stuff happening in Europe right now. 7 politicians from the right-wing AfD, Alliance for Deutschland party, have been found dead in recent months. In Europe, we're seeing elections being overturned or subverted when the results go the wrong way, which basically means people choose governments that are hostile to mass immigration. In other words, it looks to me like liberal governments are using illiberal measures to try to keep their countries, well, liberal. In 1989, at the time of the last conjunction of Saturn and Neptune, Francis Fukuyama published his book, The End of History, in which he argued that liberal democracy had essentially triumphed and that all countries would eventually move to that style of government. If there's a planet of history, it's Saturn, often called the Lord of Karma, or just Old Father Time. Neptune dissolves things, and so perhaps at that key moment, with Neptune meeting Saturn, Fukuyama was perceiving a dissolution of history. With the Berlin Wall falling at that time, you could be forgiven for thinking that it was, but it was only temporary. And now, at another conjunction of Saturn and Neptune, we can see that the triumph of liberal democracy hasn't come. Powerful rising countries of the East, like Russia and China, haven't embraced democracy as people like Fukuyama predicted. Instead, they're sticking with much more authoritarian styles of government that they argue are more in line with their own cultures and history. China is well known to be leading the way in the implementation of technocratic, technological authoritarianism in the form of its social credit system that it uses to manage the population. Countries in the West like to point fingers at this, but it seems to me that they are heading in a very similar direction right now. And then there's the growing power of markets and institutions of transnational governance like the EU. I can't help but think of what happened to Liz Truss's government again in the UK in 2022. It imploded after just 44 days and became the shortest-lived government in UK history. Essentially, what happened is that Truss and her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, rolled out a package of free market Thatcherite policies, including massive tax cuts that they thought would get the economy moving. And what happened is the markets didn't like the policies, the pound collapsed and Truss had to reverse everything. Her authority collapsed and she was forced to resign. Now, the point here isn't that Truss's policies were good. Perhaps they weren't. It was that we saw how governments can now be completely overruled by the markets these days if they fly in the face of what finance people think they should be doing. That's not democracy, at least not how I understand it. We're also seeing the growing power of international bureaucracies like the EU, the WHO, the WEF, the World Economic Forum, the UN, and so on. Again, when you see that countries around the world are all rolling out things like digital ID at the same time, it does make you wonder if the politicians are taking their cues from the recommendations of internationalist institutions like this, rather than their voters. Some observers have suggested that we've entered the era of technocratic managerialism, where all problems are supposedly just technical problems to be fixed by experts. We saw this during the pandemic when we were told to just trust the experts who would guide policy with advice backed by the science, TM. What a lot of people missed is that governance always involves political decisions, but the professional managerial or expert class these days seems to be oblivious to the ways in which it prioritizes its own interests and those of its corporate paymasters. And in this era of social media saturation, what seems to be most important to governments is not necessarily fixing problems, but fixing the perception of problems. That's why people are getting arrested for tweets in Britain. All right. That's my summary of the situation. Now let's get into what the astrology tells us. Jupiter and Saturn were the two slowest moving planets of the traditional planetary pantheon, and as such they were said to speak to the sources of authority in society. Jupiter is more about vision, faith, and ideals, while Saturn has to do with rules, regulations, and administration. They form a conjunction every 20 years, and their cycle speaks to how societies are governed. The interesting thing about this cycle is that due to the geometry of the solar system and of the zodiac itself, these conjunctions tend to take place in signs of the same element over and over again for about 200 years. Then they move to the next element. So you get an 800-year cycle. 200 years of fire, followed by 200 of earth, then 200 years of air, and then 200 years of water, and then the cycle repeats. These are often referred to as elemental ages. They tell us about the rise and fall of empires and dynasties, as well as about the style of governance, general ethos, and even technologies of the time. Now, I said we get 200 years of conjunctions in each element, but due to planetary retrogrades, the reality is actually a bit more complicated than that. At the beginning and end of each elemental age, there's a bit of back and forth between the elements. So, for example, from 1842 until 1961, there was an unbroken sequence of conjunctions in the earth element, which is related to the tangible and material aspects of life. In this period, we saw the conquering of the globe by capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, and the adoption in many places of a very materialist and even atheistic mindset. Heading further into the past, the 17th and 18th centuries were an age of fire. In Europe, this was the period of the age of absolutism, which saw extremely powerful monarchs who centralized all power into themselves. Now, to understand why that would happen in an age of fire, you need only look at the planets that are represented through their rulership of the fire signs. The sun is very powerful in the fire triplicity. It rules Leo, it's exalted in Aries, and it's the primary triplicity ruler of the fire signs. The sun is central in the solar system, and so it represents themes like centrality and visibility and so on. And so in this age of fire, we saw extremely powerful centralizing rulers like Russia's Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, Prussia's Frederick the Great, and France's Louis XIV, who was even called the Sun King. At the end of that age of fire in the late 18th century, with Pluto in Aquarius, there was a big wave of revolts against these very centralized regimes, including the French and American revolutions. And those revolutions set the stage for the rise of the democratic nation states in the 19th and 20th centuries during the age of Earth that followed. This was also the period where representative democracy spread across the planet. In a representative democracy, people elect politicians to make the laws for them. Other kinds of democracy are possible, such as direct democracy, in which the people are asked to vote on laws themselves. The prime example of one of these is Switzerland. But why might you see democracy flourishing in the age of Earth? Well, I have a theory on that, and it has to do with the planets in the Earth triplicity and their rulerships. The moon is very powerful in Earth. It's the second triplicity ruler of the Earth signs. And crucially, it's also exalted in the sign of Taurus. Exalted means it's lifted up and given great respect, as if it's the lord of the manor. And so think of the difference between the age of fire with the exalted sun and rule by the likes of Louis XIV, and then the age of Earth with the exalted moon, where the ideal was rule by the people. Even the non-democratic governments that arose in this period centered the people. Think of the People's Republic of China. Hitler supposedly saw himself as the tribune of the German people. In other words, as the representative of the German people. And here's where this gets really interesting, because we can go back in time and see that democracy arguably has its origins in an age of Earth. Conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn were taking place in Earth signs between 642 and 344 BC. This is the period in which Athenian democracy, which is often held up as history's first democracy, emerged. The birth of Athenian democracy is generally dated to the reforms of Cleisthenes in about 508 or 507 BC, when he introduced equal political rights for Athenians. Now, almost exactly the same time, over in Rome in 509 BC, the Romans expelled their king and created a republic. But the ordinary people, known as the plebeians, had no representation in the republic, which was dominated by patricians or aristocrats. About 15 years later, in 494 BC, the plebs staged a protest against this state of affairs. They said they weren't going to fight in Rome's wars without any representation in government. And so that year, Rome instituted the role of tribune of the plebs, a person whose job it was to represent the ordinary people of Rome in government. Now again, think of the exaltation of the moon in the Earth triplicity. The moon is exalted in the sign of Taurus. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that came before this tribune of the plebs was instituted happened in 503 BC in, you guessed it, Taurus. So there's something about ages of Earth bringing representation of the people in government. And indeed, the 19th and 20th centuries saw countries all across the globe adopting democratic systems. But now we've left the age of Earth for an age of air, and that is going to have implications for democracy. In 1980, after 140 years of conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in Earth signs, we saw the first air conjunction of the current cycle. 20 years later, there was one last conjunction in Earth in the sign of Taurus in the year 2000. And then in December 2020, the conjunctions moved into the air signs permanently, with a conjunction in the first degree of the forward-looking, collectively oriented sign of Aquarius. So we're firmly in an age of air now. What can we expect? Well, we have to think about the nature of these elements. Earth is structured and stable, but air is fast-moving and chaotic. Air is the element we associate with communication. Think of how sound passes through the air, and of the idea of signs in the sky, a form of communication that would have deeply impressed the ancients who developed astrology in this way of thinking. Since the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions of 1980 and 81, we've certainly seen the influence of the air element in the technology we're using. For example, the 20-year period following those conjunctions saw the birth of the World Wide Web. Interestingly enough, the conjunctions returned to the Earth element in the year 2000. I'd argue that following that period, the web became much more earthy. It was less chaotic and free than it was in the early days. It was taken over by a small number of big companies like Google and Facebook and Apple that wanted to herd us into their walled gardens. Again, think of Earth. The web became all about money and lost its original, more innocent, freewheeling spirit. But now we're fully into the age of air. You can already see how the internet is starting to fragment again. For example, Twitter is now just one of several similar microblogging networks, including Threads and Blue Sky and so forth. And people are also retreating more and more into private chats. I think we're going to see more and more fragmentation of this kind over time. This is the nature of air. The Jupiter-Saturn cycle has to do with governance. And in air ages, I've seen that power seems to move towards airy people. Think of nomads, who are people who keep moving like the air. In the last age of air, Genghis Khan's Mongols built their empire. They were nomadic people from the windy steppe of Mongolia. And today we are in the era of the digital nomad. Now, the elemental age seems to tell us something about the metaphysical weather of the times. In ages of Earth, there's an emphasis on trade and the growth of trade networks. In air ages, there's a rapid growth in the spread of ideas and information. But this is where the trouble comes, because the free flow of ideas isn't something power tends to be comfortable with. And so these ages of air are times when more effort than ever before is put into controlling thought. The last air age came between 1186 and 1425. During this period, the Catholic Church founded the medieval Inquisition. This was the Church's attempt to crack down on heresy using the tools of bureaucracy and violence. In particular, the first targets of the Inquisition were the Cathars of southern France, who had a faith that you could describe as Gnostic. Like the Gnostic Christians of the early centuries of the first millennium, the Cathars believed that this world was created by an evil god, but that there was a true God above him. They believed that Christianity had been corrupted by the Catholic hierarchy and that true knowledge of spiritual reality would provide salvation. Gnosis means knowledge. Of course, this didn't endear them to the church, which set out to destroy them in the 13th century, again during an age of air. What came was the so-called Albigensian Crusade, named after the city of Albi in southern France, where many Cathars lived. This was the only crusade launched by the church against Christians, and it saw the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Cathars in the Languedoc region. This was essentially a war, or a genocide if you prefer, against people who had the wrong ideas. Now, in his book about the Inquisition, God's Jury, the writer Cullen Murphy explains why the Inquisition appeared when it did. He points out that intolerance and hatred had always existed, but that the tools to turn intolerance into an institution only appeared in the late medieval period. Of these tools, he says this: there needs to be a system of law and the means to administer it with a certain amount of uniformity. There needs to be a well-defined process for conducting interrogations and extracting information. Procedures must exist for record keeping and for retrieving information after records have been compiled and stored. An administrative mechanism, a bureaucracy, is required, along with a cadre of trained people to staff it. There must be an ability to send messages across significant distances, and also some capacity to restrict the communications of others, and there must be a source of power to ensure enforcement. The point he's making, and which we need to bear in mind now, is that power always makes use of the capabilities it possesses. Now think of our current times. We have a new technology, the internet, which potentially enables total surveillance of everyone, everywhere. No government in history has ever had the level of power that this technology can confer. And of course, now that the ability to roll out total and constant surveillance on the populace is becoming available, governments and their security and intelligence organs are availing themselves of it. During the Age of Earth, communication technologies were centralized. As a result, there was much more homogeneity in terms of people's beliefs. At the very least, even if they had political differences, people agreed on the basic facts of history in the main. That's no longer true. Today, we're finding that we can barely have a conversation about politics with people who aren't like-minded, because we're all consuming completely different narratives about what's going on that are based on different collections of facts about the world. And of course, this is a problem for governments and security agencies. The decentralized nature of the communication technology we have now is seen as a problem to be managed. Perhaps it could be said that from their perspective in the Earth Age, they could afford to let people speak freely because most people didn't have a platform that they could use to influence a lot of others. Today, anyone can be a broadcaster and can influence people to think things that the government doesn't want them to think. Now, there's something else we need to bear in mind here, which is that the move from the Age of Earth to the Age of Air will signify changes to the global pecking order in terms of which civilizations rise and fall. And I think that in part that has to do with the history and inclinations and even metaphysics of different civilizations. Some of them are just better able to manage this kind of decentralized technology. I'm thinking here of how China has essentially created a separate Chinese internet and how it tightly manages what can and can't be said on it. It's much harder for Western governments to do that because there's more of a tradition of free speech that means there's a lot more resistance to attempts to control it. Incidentally, China's recent rise began around 1980 when the triplicity shift started from Earth to air with the first conjunctions in an air sign in Libra. This is when Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping initiated market reforms in that country that brought China into the global trading system and ultimately which has made it increasingly wealthy. I'd also point out that in Western tradition, the element of air is associated with the East. Perhaps a broad interpretation of a shift to the air triplicity is that power moves east. In the last Age of Air, that certainly happened, as Genghis Khan's Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire that the world had ever seen. And so it seems pretty clear that that's at least part of what's happening. It's that the era of total Western dominance is over, and Western countries are flailing around now, electing strong men, cancelling elections, and jailing people for tweets as the economic and political conditions get harder. This doesn't mean that the West is permanently doomed or that China is going to take over the world in the same way that the US did, but it does mean that the geopolitical landscape has changed. Incidentally, there are other factors right now that I think speak to the decline of democracy as we currently know it. Another of them has to do with the synodic cycle of Uranus and Pluto. This cycle has a lot to tell us about political revolutions and how they relate to technology. And this same cycle explains a lot about the current times, including how liberal values are those of the establishment now, and why they're being enforced with increasingly illiberal measures. In the bonus section of the full version of this video, available for members of World Astrology Report, we dig into this cycle and what it tells us about the decline of democracy and why it suggests that the next big cultural revolution may be coming in the 2040s. You can watch that video by becoming a World Astrology Report member here on YouTube. And for my best value offer, become a member on my website, which will also give you access to the whole back catalogue of videos and, crucially, to my monthly long-form live streams, which you really need to watch if you want to understand the bigger picture to all this. Now, before we go, let's change tack. While I think that representative democracy is probably going to continue to decline in the coming years, the shifting nature of the times will also enable new forms of governance to take root. Let's pivot away from thinking about what's falling away at the moment and consider what the possibilities of the new elemental age could be. Remember that here we're thinking about a shift from the element of earth to that of air. We're moving from fixed hierarchical structures towards airy styles of governance. There's a sense with air that there's no hierarchy and that everyone can connect to everyone else. We've seen this by comparing the internet with centralized broadcast technologies. But what might this mean in terms of governance? Well, if earthy democracy is representative, then perhaps airy democracy is direct. In a representative democracy, we elect people who make the laws for us. In a direct democracy, we participate directly in these processes ourselves. We vote on decisions about how our communities are going to work, how money is allocated, what the laws should be, and so on. Now, there is a country in the world that practices direct democracy, and that country is Switzerland, where citizens vote on practically everything and at every level of governance, from the national level to the level of the canton and down to the community. Swiss voters receive ballots 4 times a year. They might vote on whether or not the country should set CO2 targets, or whether or not drugs should be decriminalized in their canton, or even something as small fry as what should be on the city crest. And guess what? You can trace Swiss democracy back to the 13th century, when Swiss citizens would gather in open-air assemblies called Landsgemeinden to vote on local matters. And funnily enough, this was an age of air. Now, it seems to me that the very same technologies that enable things like inquisitions and disinformation czars and Palantir could also enable direct democracy and bring citizens more directly into political decision-making. I know there are problems with online voting, with fraud and hacking and so forth, but you would think that there'd be ways of overcoming these issues. And we should bear in mind that the age of air is a 200-year period, so even if right now isn't the time, perhaps opportunities will arise. Over a longer period of time like that, we could even see new forms of state emerge. The nation state, in terms of being defined by the connection of people to a particular patch of land, seems to be a creature of the age of earth. What could states evolve into in the age of air? Well, perhaps this would be a state in which people are united by shared ideals or ideas. And here we have to consider the idea of the network state, as proposed by the Silicon Valley investor Balaji Srinivasan in his book of the same name. The network state is essentially a state that organizes itself online, at least in the early days. Balaji's proposal is that prospective citizens could eventually pool their resources, then start to buy actual land, and finally achieve some kind of sovereignty as a state that could negotiate with nation states. This is an idea being taken quite seriously in certain circles, particularly the crypto world. The 3rd ever Network State Conference just took place in Singapore. It was attended by the likes of Ethereum founder Vitalik Buterin and Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong. Whatever you think of this idea, love it or hate it, it seems to me that it really does fit the nature of the times and the shift into the air triplicity. After all, sooner or later, all this technology is going to have a more direct influence on governance. And that's what the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn are about. Amazingly, there's even a kind of precedent for this sort of idea from the last age of air in the late medieval period, the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League was a network of cities run by merchants in Europe. They had standardized laws and weights and measures, and they cooperated for purposes of mutual defense and negotiation with foreign rulers. At its height, the Hanseatic League included nearly 200 towns and cities. Interestingly enough, in a recent article that I've linked below, the economics writer Noah Smith made a direct link between the idea of the network state and the precedent of the Hanseatic League. Smith points out that there are some big problems with the idea of network states, namely that they would have to compete with actual nation states for resources and loyalty and so forth. And it seems hard to imagine why nation states would allow that to happen, especially on their own turf. So he's proposed a new version of the network state idea that he's called network cities. This would be a network of quasi-independent city-states that are part of their host countries, but also have a degree of autonomy. He proposes Hong Kong as a model for what these states could look like. Until 1997, Hong Kong was a British overseas territory off the coast of China. It was prosperous and capitalistic, and it worked differently to communist China, but also offered China benefits and a way to interface with the capitalist world. According to Smith's vision, which he calls network cities, citizens could move between these different city-states. They'd be a kind of international mobile class of tech types and digital nomads. This idea solves some of the problems of the network state, in particular that there's no good reason why nation states would permit network states to exist. Now, right now, this might seem quite pie in the sky, but remember that the age of air will take us well into the 22nd century. But there's clearly a reason why people like Balaji and Noah Smith are talking about and getting excited by these ideas now. The fundamentals of the times have changed. Even if these people aren't into astrology, and I assume they're not, they're sensing the new possibilities that the times provide. But you'll probably have noticed that all the stuff I've talked about depends on information technology. Does every possible future have to include being connected to the internet all the time? Well, not necessarily. I think another thread of the times is going to be people setting up self-sufficient, intentional communities that are united in their ideals and vision for what life should be. In this video, I talked about how I thought humanity was in the process of splitting into different camps, in particular between those who want to dive deeper into transhumanism and those who reject it. I think we saw clear evidence of this split emerging during the pandemic period when, let's just say, we saw different attitudes emerging towards technologies, trust in science, and the power of the state. As time goes by, this question is going to become more pressing, because the intentions of the technologists driving the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, to use Klaus Schwab's term, are clear. They want us to merge more and more deeply with technology. Having us stare at smartphones all day isn't enough for these people. They want to put their technology inside us. They want us wearing their wearables, and they'll tell us it's dangerous if we don't, or at least make our health insurance unaffordable if we don't accept them. And so the question is going to become more and more pressing. I think this is going to lead to more pushes for people to opt out of mainstream society and to form their own communities with different values and rules. That feels very Pluto in Aquarius to me. Pluto in Aquarius is about the establishment of new power centers at the margins of empire and about the empowerment of all things Aquarian, including technologists, but also collectives of people linked by ideas. We saw a huge proliferation in groups and societies arranged around ideas during the last Pluto in Aquarius transit from 1777 to 1798. And some of those groups became hugely influential, like the Jacobin Club, founded in 1789, which became the engine of the French Revolution, or the Bavarian Illuminati, founded in 1776, just before Pluto moved into Aquarius. But also keep in mind a warning. Pluto tends to take things to the extremes and to show us what something looks like when it's given all the power in the world. Think of how the French Revolution ended with the Terror. So we need to be careful where these groups take us. All right, that's it for this video. In the bonus section, available for members of World Astrology Report, we go into another important factor that I've left out of this video for brevity's sake. That's the synodic cycle of Uranus and Pluto, a driver of cultural revolutions and reactions to them. That's it for this video. See you again very soon.